What if I told you that one of Alexander the Great's most important victories was not really a battle at all? No thunderous clash of armies outside the walls, no desperate siege towers, no final stand in the streets. Instead, Babylon, the greatest city in the ancient world, a city of walls, temples, wealth, and imperial prestige, fell to Alexander through fear, calculation, ritual, and political theater. And that may have made it even more important than a battlefield victory. Because when Alexander entered Babylon in 331 BC, he did not just take a city. He took the image of empire itself. After crushing Darius III at Gaugamela on October 1st, 331 BC, Alexander stood at a turning point. He had shattered the last great field army of the Persian Empire. But winning one battle, even one as decisive as Gaugamela, did not automatically make him ruler of Asia. That required something more. He had to convert battlefield victory into real imperial control. He had to seize the administrative capitals, the treasuries, the religious centers, and the symbols of royal legitimacy. And among all those places, Babylon mattered more than almost any other. Babylon was rich, Babylon was ancient, Babylon was politically powerful, and Babylon carried enormous symbolic weight. If Alexander could take Babylon, he would not just be a conqueror from the West. He could present himself as the new legitimate ruler of the Near East. But here is the key point. Alexander did not storm Babylon. He entered it. And the difference between those two things tells us a lot about how he conquered empires.
To understand Babylon, we have to begin at Gaugamela. At Gaugamela, Alexander defeated Darius in one of the most famous battles in history. The Persian king fled. His army disintegrated. The military balance of the entire empire collapsed in a single day. But even after such a victory, Alexander still faced a huge strategic problem. The Persian Empire was enormous. It was held together not only by armies, but by satraps, treasuries, priesthoods, administrative systems, and elite loyalty. If those structures remained intact, then Darius could still regroup somewhere farther east.
So Alexander had to move fast. His next objective was obvious: Babylon.
Ancient writers tell us that after Gaugamela, Alexander moved through Arbela and then marched south toward the great Mesopotamian metropolis. Modern scholarship, combined with Babylonian records, suggests that within less than 3 weeks, Alexander had reached the Babylonian region. That speed matters. He was not giving the empire time to recover. He was not allowing Babylon to prepare for a prolonged resistance. He was turning military shock into political collapse. And Babylon was vulnerable for another reason. Its defenders now knew what had happened at Gaugamela. They knew Darius had fled. They knew the royal field army had failed. And they knew Alexander was coming.
Babylon was not just another city on Alexander's route. It was one of the great capitals of the ancient world. It was a place of immense wealth and old prestige. It had monumental walls, major temples, royal infrastructure, and a long history as a seat of imperial authority. Even under Persian rule, Babylon still mattered as an administrative and economic center. And for Alexander, it offered 3 major prizes. First, it offered logistics and resources. A conqueror cannot live on glory alone. He needs grain, housing, roads, treasury access, and a city capable of supporting an army. Babylon could provide all of that. Second, it offered administrative continuity. If Alexander wanted to rule an empire larger than anything Macedonia had ever controlled, he needed functioning systems,
not endless devastation. Babylon gave him access to precisely that.
And third, perhaps most importantly, it offered legitimacy. Babylon was home to great temple institutions, especially the religious complex of Esagila and Etamananki. In the ancient Near East, kingship was never purely military. It was tied to ritual, sacred space, and public recognition. Taking Babylon peacefully and presenting himself as protector rather than destroyer gave Alexander a chance to appear not merely as a conqueror, but as a lawful ruler. That is why Babylon was so important, and that is why the way he took it mattered just as much as the fact that he took it.
This is the central thing many people misunderstand. There was no major pitched battle at Babylon in 331 BC. The evidence points instead to a negotiated surrender followed by a carefully controlled entry into the city. That evidence comes from two broad kinds of sources. First, we have later Greek and Roman narratives. Writers like Arrian, Curtius Rufus, and Diodorus. They describe Alexander's approach, the surrender of the city, the formal handover of key positions, and Alexander's orderly entrance. Second, and even more importantly, we have a Babylonian Astronomical Diary, a contemporary cuneiform record. That source is incredibly valuable because it comes from the world Alexander was entering, not just from much later classical tradition.
And the diary strongly supports the same overall picture. Instead of describing siege warfare, it records a sequence of political and ritual actions, messages about temple affairs, an order issued from Sippar, the approach to the gate area near Esagila, ritual gestures, and then Alexander's entry. This is not the language of a city taken by storm. It is the language of surrender, ritual, and controlled transfer of power. So, if there was no battle, what happened instead? What happened was something arguably more sophisticated. Alexander approached Babylon ready for battle, but did not need to fight one.
One of the most striking details in the ancient accounts is that Alexander approached Babylon in battle formation. Arrian says he drew up his army in order of battle. Curtius goes even further, saying Alexander formed his forces into a square and advanced as though they were marching into combat. Now, why would he do that if the city was already surrendering? Because surrender is one of the most dangerous moments in war. A city that has agreed to submit may still erupt into chaos. A gate could become a choke point. A nervous garrison could panic. A faction inside the city could attempt resistance. And an undisciplined victorious army could start looting, which would destroy the very city Alexander wanted intact.
So marching in battle order was not unnecessary caution. It was the tactic. It projected strength. It prevented disorder. It discouraged treachery. And it ensured that Alexander entered Babylon as master of events, not as a guest at the mercy of a huge and still potentially volatile city. That is what made this operation so effective. Alexander used the threat of force, backed by discipline, to achieve submission without urban destruction. In other words, Babylon fell not to a charge, but to controlled intimidation.
No account of Babylon is complete without Mazaeus. Mazaeus was a major Persian official associated with Babylonia, and after Gaugamela, he became the man who effectively delivered Babylon to Alexander. This is crucial. Empires do not collapse only because kings lose battles. They collapse because elite loyalty breaks. And when Mazaeus surrendered Babylon rather than resisting behind its formidable defenses, he was doing more than opening a city gate. He was signaling that the old imperial structure was cracking from within.
Another important figure mentioned in the sources is Bagaphanes, the official associated with the citadel and the royal treasury.
That detail matters because it shows what was really at stake in Babylon. Not just streets and houses, but the core machinery of power. The citadel, the treasury, the temples, the administrative heart of the province. So Babylon was not captured in the ordinary battlefield sense. It was handed over at the highest level. And Alexander understood exactly how to exploit that. Rather than destroying the local elite structure outright, he often co-opted it. In fact, after entering Babylon, Alexander retained Mazaeus in office as satrap. That was not weakness, it was smart empire building. Alexander was showing that he could conquer Persia not only by crushing its armies, but by absorbing its governing class.
This is where Babylon becomes especially fascinating. The Babylonian Diary suggests that Alexander's approach and entry were tied to ritual gestures near the Esagila complex. There were references to a gate near the temple precinct, to prostration, and to temple-related messaging. That tells us something essential. This was not just a military occupation. It was a ceremonial transfer of authority. Babylon was a city where kingship had religious dimensions. To enter its sacred and political spaces in the right way mattered enormously. Alexander appears to have understood this. He did not simply barge in as a foreign raider. He seems to have presented himself as a restorer and protector. One famous tradition says he ordered the rebuilding of temples allegedly damaged under Xerxes. Now, modern historians are much more cautious about taking those old accusations against Xerxes at face value. The old image of Xerxes as a straightforward destroyer of Babylonian temples has been heavily challenged. But whether or not the classical blame on Xerxes is accurate, the political message is clear. Alexander wanted to appear as the king who respected Babylon's sanctuaries. That message would have been incredibly useful. It reassured temple elites, it reduced the risk of unrest, and it helped Alexander frame his conquest not as an act of random violence, but as the beginning of a new, legitimate order. This is one of the reasons Babylon was so important in Alexander's rise. At Babylon, he was not just winning, he was performing kingship.
Once Alexander entered Babylon, the immediate results were enormous. First, he secured one of the richest and most important urban centers in the empire without destroying it. Second, he gained access to administrative infrastructure and revenue. Third, he gave his army rest, supplies, and stability after the rapid and exhausting campaign that followed Gaugamela. Ancient sources say he remained in Babylon for an extended period, more than 30 days according to Diodorus. That pause was important. Conquests are not sustained by momentum alone. They require consolidation. Alexander also placed a Macedonian force in control of the citadel. Diodorus mentions a guard of 700 Macedonian soldiers under Agathon of Pydna.
Even though Babylon surrendered peacefully, Alexander still understood that the city needed firm control. Peaceful submission did not eliminate the need for hard military security. It simply made security easier to maintain. We also hear of the distribution of money and rewards. That too was vital. Paying troops after victory helped secure loyalty and reduce the temptation for uncontrolled plunder. So the outcome of Babylon was not just political theater, it was highly practical. Alexander rested his men, he secured treasure, he reassured local elites, he installed a new order. And he prepared for the next phase of the campaign. From Babylon, the road led onward to Susa. And by the time he moved again, Alexander was no longer simply invading Persia, he was ruling it.
When people think of Alexander's greatest qualities, they usually think of battlefield genius, Granicus, Isis, Gaugamela. And that makes sense. He was one of history's most brilliant commanders. But Babylon shows us another side of him. It shows us Alexander the political operator. It shows us Alexander the image maker. It shows us Alexander the imperial strategist. Because at Babylon, he understood something absolutely fundamental. Sometimes the greatest victory is the one that preserves what you are trying to own. Had he stormed Babylon, sacked it, and left it ruined, he might still have won a military success, but he would have destroyed a key administrative and symbolic prize. Instead, he did the opposite. He entered with discipline. He controlled the transition. He respected powerful local institutions, at least publicly. He retained useful officials, and he transformed a defeated imperial city into a working pillar of his own empire. That is not just conquest, that is statecraft. And in many ways, it is exactly why Alexander advanced so far, so fast. He did not simply smash resistance. He knew when to turn victory into legitimacy.
So, was there a Battle of Babylon? Not in the way people usually imagine. There was no second Gaugamela outside the walls, no legendary siege in the style of Tyre, no catastrophic urban bloodbath. The reality is more subtle and more interesting. Babylon fell through a combination of military terror, elite surrender, ritual accommodation, and careful entry. It was an operation where the most important terrain was not a battlefield ridge or a river crossing, but the city's centers of power. The gates, the temple precinct, the citadel, the treasury, and the loyalties of the people who controlled them. That is why Babylon matters so much in the story of Alexander. It shows the moment when battlefield conquest became imperial rule. And that transition is everything. Because defeating Darius made Alexander a victor. Taking Babylon made him look like a king.
In the end, Babylon may have been one of Alexander's greatest victories, precisely because it was not a great battle. It was the peaceful submission of one of the ancient world's greatest cities. It was the collapse of Persian resistance at the elite level. It was a carefully staged entry into a city where ritual, legitimacy, and administration mattered as much as swords and spears.
And it proved that Alexander was more than a battlefield commander. He was building an empire.
So when we talk about Babylon in 331 BC, we should stop imagining only the clash that never happened, because the real story is even more powerful. Alexander did not have to destroy Babylon to conquer it. He only had to make the city believe the empire had already changed hands.
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment. Thanks for watching.